The sand is already in your lungs before you even reach the base. You feel it first in your throat, that dry, abrasive burn that no amount of swallowing can fix. Then you see it, a wall of limestone rising so far above you that the top disappears into morning haze, and every single block in that wall was moved by human hands, human backs, human bodies that bled and buckled and sometimes simply stopped. You are standing at the foot of one of the most celebrated structures in human history, and the first thing you feel is not wonder. It is dread. Because something about the scale of this place does not feel like triumph. It feels like a warning. The pyramid builders of ancient Egypt have been painted for centuries as devoted servants, willing participants in a divine construction project, men who raised stone to the sky out of love for their pharaoh and faith in their gods. But the closer you look at what those men actually left behind, in their bones, their graffiti, their medical records, their burial sites right here in the shadow of the pyramids, the more that image of willing devotion starts to crack. The truth hiding inside the construction camps of Giza is darker, stranger, and far more human than any museum exhibit will tell you. And it starts not with admiration, but with fear. To understand why the pyramid builders were terrified of their own work, you first have to understand the world they came from. These were not slaves, according to the most current archaeological evidence. They were conscripted laborers, rotating crews pulled from villages across Egypt under a system called the corvée, a form of mandatory state service. In theory, they were fed, housed, and compensated. In practice, they were dropped into one of the most dangerous construction environments in the ancient world, with tools that would make a modern safety inspector weep. No hard hats, no scaffolding regulations, no emergency exits, just ramps, ropes, sledges, wooden levers, and the unforgiving geometry of millions of tons of rock stacked at an angle specifically designed to reach the heavens. You would have arrived at Giza already exhausted from the journey. The workers came from as far as Upper Egypt, hundreds of miles south, marching or sailing to a place that was already legendary before the first block was ever set. They had heard stories, everyone had heard stories, and stories, when they involve mountains built by human hands, carry a particular kind of fear that faith alone cannot completely silence. The bones tell the beginning of that story. Excavations at the Workers' Cemetery near Giza, discovered in 1990, revealed skeletons showing healed fractures, compressed spinal discs, arthritic joints in men who died before they were 40, and evidence of surgical amputations that somehow survived the operation. These are not the remains of men who lived gently. The spinal damage alone paints a picture of daily loading so severe that by their mid-30s, many workers could barely stand straight. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. These injuries were not hidden or shameful. The men buried in that cemetery received careful burials. They were interred with food offerings and basic grave goods, which meant the state acknowledged them, remembered them, honored them in some formal sense. But honored men with shattered spines are still men with shattered spines. You do not bury someone with reverence and then pretend the work that broke him was not also the work that terrified him. The vertical reality of pyramid construction is something that photographs and scale models fail to communicate. When you are inside the construction process, not as a tourist looking up from a safe distance, but as a worker whose entire purpose is to drag a limestone block weighing anywhere from 2 to 15 tons up an increasingly steep ramp of compacted rubble and mud brick. The pyramid above you is not a monument. It is a living threat. Blocks shifted, ramps collapsed, ropes snapped. Experimental calculations suggest that even a single misaligned stone at the upper levels of the structure could create cascading pressure failures that would send debris the size of carriages tumbling down slopes at speeds no human being could outrun. And this was not a theoretical risk. It was a daily operational reality. The higher the pyramid grew, the more terrifying the physics became. You would have known, everyone on that site would have known, that the thing you were building was also entirely capable of killing you. The work was divided into rotating gangs, each one given a name. Archaeologists have found these names painted in red ochre on blocks inside the Great Pyramid itself. Phrases like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure, which sound almost playful until you realize they were the identity tags of men who spent their working lives in intimate contact with an object designed to outlive every human civilization that would ever exist. The gangs competed against each other for productivity quotas, which meant there was social pressure layered on top of physical danger. Falling behind was not just a personal failure, it was a collective shame. And in a world where your gang's name was literally carved into the stone above your head, shame and fear were not separable things. You carried both into the work every single morning. What the ancient Egyptian state understood, and what made the pyramid project so psychologically complex for the men who built it, was that the pyramid was not just architecture. It was theology made physical. The structure you were building was the literal vessel that would carry the soul of a god-king into eternity. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was the embodiment of Horus in life and Osiris in death, the hinge between the human world and the divine one. Which meant that every block you placed was a sacred act, and every mistake you made was a transgression against the cosmic order. Imagine spending your days moving stone under that kind of metaphysical pressure. You could not simply do a bad job. A bad job was not just dangerous physically, it was dangerous supernaturally. The fear was not only that the ramp would collapse, the fear was also that the gods were watching, that the dead king's spirit was already hovering over the site, and that incompetence in this place had consequences that extended beyond your own death. The religious architecture of the pyramid complex reinforced this terror in ways that were entirely deliberate. The causeways leading to the pyramids were lined with walls specifically designed to prevent workers from seeing the full structure while they were inside the construction process. This was partly practical. You cannot navigate a site this large if you are constantly distracted by the view, but it was also deeply psychological. The workers were kept partially blind to the thing they were building. You moved your piece, you carried your block, you set your stone, and you trusted or feared or both that the larger shape being assembled around you was unfolding exactly as the royal architects and the gods intended. There is something distinctly unsettling about building a monument so enormous that you cannot see it while you are building it. You are both its creator and its captive. The medical situation at the Giza Plateau was another dimension of terror that most romanticized accounts skip entirely. The workers' village, which supported a rotating population of perhaps 20,000 people at peak construction periods, generated waste, infection, and epidemic risk at a scale that the ancient Egyptian world had no adequate tools to manage. Skeletal evidence shows healed infections in bone tissue, suggesting that workers survived injuries that would have required significant medical intervention. And the ancient Egyptians did have physicians. This is well documented. But the treatments available involved wound packing with honey and moldy bread, which we now understand had genuine antimicrobial properties, as well as copper-based compounds, herbal poultices, and ritual incantations spoken over infected flesh. You would lie in the workers' infirmary with a crushed forearm or a suppurating wound from a rope burn and receive a combination of practical medicine and prayer, because the Egyptians made no distinction between the two. Whether this was comforting or terrifying probably depended on how many men you had watched die in the cot next to you. There is a papyrus known as the Reisner Papyri, discovered at a site near Giza and dating to the era of pyramid construction, that contains administrative records of the labor force, accounts of food rations, crew rotations, and work logs. Reading those records today, you encounter the bureaucratic skeleton of an operation that was simultaneously magnificent and ruthless. Rations were calculated to keep men working, not to make them comfortable. Beer was issued daily, not as a luxury, but because it was caloric, safer than unfiltered water, and easier to distribute than solid food at scale. The diet was predominantly bread, beer, fish, and occasional beef or goat, which sounds adequate until you factor in the caloric demands of moving stone in desert heat for 10 to 12 hours. The beer dulled the edge of the fear, but it also meant that the men building the most precise structures in the ancient world were doing so with slightly impaired judgment, tired bodies, and a nutritional baseline that barely matched the physical demands placed on them. The heat deserves its own moment of reflection. The Giza Plateau in summer sits under a sun that turns stone into a radiating surface you cannot touch with bare hands. The limestone blocks, freshly cut and pale, reflected heat back at the workers from every direction. You would have been sweating constantly. Losing salt, your body had no reliable way to replace. Drinking warm water or warm beer from clay vessels that had been sitting in the sun, working with hands that were simultaneously dry from desert air and soaked in perspiration. And doing all of this while managing ropes, wooden sledges, and the kind of micro-decisions. Is this knot secure? Is this ramp level? Is this team ready to pull? That, if gotten wrong, could end your life or someone else's within seconds. Modern heat exhaustion takes hold at temperatures far lower than what those men routinely endured. What they experienced on a bad summer afternoon on the Giza Plateau was something that sits at the outer edge of what the human body can sustain while still performing precision physical labor. And yet the pyramids rose. Block after block, year after year, decade after decade, the structures climbed toward the sky with a precision that still baffles engineers today. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within 2 centimeters across an area of over 53,000 square meters. The cardinal alignments are accurate to a fraction of a degree. Whatever terror the workers felt, it did not stop their hands from being extraordinarily skilled. This is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. Fear and excellence existed in the same body, in the same moment, pressing the same stone into the same socket with the same trembling, calloused, utterly mortal hands. The men who built the pyramids were terrified of their own work, terrified of the physics, terrified of the theology, terrified of the gods and the dead king, watching from somewhere above the dust and the heat and the noise. And they built it anyway, with a precision so relentless that 2,000 years after their death, Julius Caesar would stand at the foot of these same structures and feel exactly what you would feel standing there today. Not pride, not admiration. Something older and colder than either of those things. When the last capstone was set and the outer casing of white Tura limestone was polished until it shone like something from another world, the men who did that polishing walked back down the ramps and returned to villages that would never quite understand what they had seen or touched. They went home with broken spines and healed bones and sand still in their lungs, carrying the memory of a scale of thing that their language probably had no word for. Tonight, if you reach for a glass of water without thinking, without effort, without fear, you are doing something those men could not do even once during the 10 hours they spent making one of the most extraordinary objects in human history. The pyramids were not built by men who were unafraid. They were built by men who were terrified, and who built them anyway, and whose names were painted in red on stones that have outlasted everything else they ever touched. If there is a place in history you would want to see reconstructed without the romantic version, another court, another empire, another monument built by bodies the history books forgot? Leave it in the comments. The real story is almost always stranger than the one they teach.